we talk about transportation inbound, what are we talking about? Anyone would like to take a guess at the situation that is taking place, is going on when we say inbound? The buzzwords here are, of course, are inbound. Inbound. So what's inbound, Roland? Inbound is when you insure something, right? Bonded, right? Like licensed and bonded, right? You see this, you hear this word all the time. When you see the trailer or the general contractor, you see licensed and bonded all the time. What does it mean? That means he has a license to do the work and he's insured. So in case he screws up, the insurance will cover his screw-ups. All right? So that's pretty much it. So from our discussion, maybe last week or maybe the week before last, when we were talking about bonds under part 113, we talked about situation all across the board. We talked about various types of activities that apply to bonds. We talked about CBP form 301, which is required in order to apply the bond, sort of application for the bond. And I also asked you to watch a video, and the video covered different types of bonds within, for example, activity code 1. So if you were careful watcher, you would have noticed that there is a concept of single entry bond, and then there is a concept of continuous entry bond, which pertains to customs brokers, right? This topic pertains to, I believe, to the activity code 2, which relates to the transportation entries. And the reason they are so important is because licensed customs brokers are oftentimes are intertwined. They are in one bed, if you will, with freight forwarders on this one. And to be able to recognize when bond is required and to advise your client on the best route available, you oftentimes required to have some kind of general knowledge of what your options are once the merchandise hits the border. So one example. So let's say this is the map of the United States of America, right? So if I'm not a wonderful painter or drawer, please excuse me, but this meant to be Alaska. This is Canada. And there is a little town here. Well, let's not talk about this one, okay? Let's talk about the one bordering here. It's called Seattle. Anyone heard of Seattle? It's a city located in the Evergreen State of Washington. It is also a port town. A lot of its revenue for the state, a lot of the state revenue are derived from the import-export activities. And it also handles a lot of freight. And if you notice, because this is a Pacific Ocean, a lot of freight from China, from the People's Republic China, and from Southeast Asia comes in. Sometimes to LA, but sometimes to Seattle. But we are not in Seattle, right? We are all where? We're in New York, right? So New York is somewhere over here. So New York, I just mark it NY. And a client comes to you, he brings containers. He brings containers by ship. It doesn't have to be by ship, but ship is a very good example. So this is a steamship line. It arrives over here. And you need the freight over here. Okay, so your client comes to you and they want you are the licensed customs broker, and they want the container in New York. And the way the routing schedule works is it arrives to Seattle. Now, in this chapter, we will have some options that we can offer to our client, depending on their requirements. This may or may not work for them. So one option is to, and the merchandise, let's say it's for the store, it's for consumption, right? You bring it in and you want to sell it in your local department store, for example. So you bring the merchandise here by rail. It's a little train, let's say here. So there is like this little rail that goes in here, right? And there is a question: when the container gets offloaded from the boat to the train, it can be a truck. It can even be a pipeline if it's oil, for example, or gas. But let's take the most typical example. So if it goes by train, we need to know, is the bond required for the merchandise? And my question would be, when is it required? And the reason for this question is because if the bond is required, bond equals insurance. Remember, it's an insurance policy, just in case something happens to merchandise. Of course, this route will be more expensive because it has to be insured. Sometimes it is not required, which also means it's going to be less expensive. And of course, when we talk about money, it can, when we talk about the bottom line, this may be very important to your client. So knowing what the options are can be very important, strategically speaking. So this chapter, they discuss us when the bond is required and when it is not. And can anyone think of an example when the bond would be required? Anyone? When would they have to have it? What would be the situation? Let me narrow the question down. When would I have to have it? Let's say this: if I have to have it, do I need to clear customs in New York or in Seattle? New York. Right. Because it's inbound means that it hasn't cleared customs yet. And of course, since we are in a world of customs broker examination, we kind of have to realize that it's kind of like you traveling, let's say, to Seattle, but then flying to New York and you clearing customs in New York, right? You haven't entered technically the United States because you travel through the transit zones, right? So it's almost the same concept. Since this merchandise is not entered, is not in the United States, technically speaking, it is still in customs custody. And because it is in customs custody, if something happens to the merchandise, let's say robber bandits, right, steal stuff from it somewhere in Kansas, if it goes through Kansas, or let's say there is a flood or a lightning strike and the merchandise gets destroyed, or let's say the merchandise arrives and pieces are unaccounted for. Who takes responsibility for damaged, lost, or missing merchandise? Well, in this case, if it is to be cleared in New York, it would be the person who holds that bond. And by person, I'm talking about, it can be the legal entity like the rail carrier or the truck company, or it can be the physical person, like me, or like you guys. So here in this situation, the typical answer to this question would be it is the person who holds the bond, which is the rail company in our example. If it's a truck, let's say freight forwarder, it would be the trucking company. So this is pretty much the whole concept of this chapter. And of course, knowing that, let me change the hypothetical. What if I clear freight in Seattle as opposed to New York? When would I need to have a? Do I need to transport it in bond? Do I need a bond? No, I see people shaking their hand. That's right. I would not need a bond. Now, when I spoke about these bond situations, I was speaking of them as a matter of choice. Sometimes it may not be the choice. Let's say you bring in the seashells, not from People's Republic of China, but from Philippines. And you bring in those shells, and those shells are controlled by another agency. Let's say Fish and Wildlife Services, which is under the Department of the Interior, which is a whole different department, because we learned that what department is overseeing the Customs and Border Protection? Do you want to take a crack at it? Yeah? What department? Is a Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Interior? Which department is over Customs and Border Protection? Pick one. Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, Interior. Yes, Homeland Security, guys. That's right. It's Department of Homeland Security. So let's say you bring the seashells to Seattle, but because of the budget cuts, or what we recently learned, there is a new word that's been introduced, sequester. Have anyone heard of sequester? Oh, you guys are not listening to Barack Obama lately. When Republicans and Democrats cannot agree, then Barack Obama puts in place what's known as sequester. And sequester is another word for all across the board cuts. So wherever you can cut government spending, you do that. There are non-essentials. There are some essential services, but there are some non-essential services. So what can it translate to in terms of transportation inbound? We are talking about transportation inbound after all. Well, how about that the office for the Fish and Wildlife Services in Seattle gets closed? Sequester, and the only one that's open is in New York, on your way. What happens? This means that in order to clear customs, you must comply with other agencies' requirements. So if it's food, you must meet requirements of Food and Drug Administration. If it's meat, let's say beef, it must meet the United States Department of Agriculture regulations. If it's wildlife, such as seashells, right? You go to the dollar store, you try to buy seashells, or you go to the beach over here, you get seashells. What's seashell? It's a wildlife. It's not homegrown. Does anyone grow seashells? I don't see any volunteers. Yeah. It's possible to grow seashells. I believe those people who like jewelry sometimes probably hear about pearls, right? And there's a whole industry that grows pearls. It's also mostly in Southeast Asia, but this is not an example I have in mind. I'm talking about the wildlife. So if wildlife is over here, you cannot clear customs because the office is closed. So you must get it to the Fish and Wildlife. You must clear through Fish and Wildlife, meaning you must have their stamp of approval before customs will even consider releasing this merchandise. This means you're kind of stuck. You have to have a bond here. you have to get it in bond to the Fish and Wildlife local port, and only then go to customs and clear it. So sometimes it's a matter of choice, sometimes it's a matter of necessity. Notwithstanding the question of necessity or choice, it is intertwined. It often appears on customs broker exam. So we really need to be familiar with the terminology and details, the protocol, if you will, which required for merchandise to be transported in bond from point A to point B. Before I dive into these details, I also want to, I covered one situation. I covered the situation when the things go from Seattle to New York. But it can apply to multiple situations. The typical situation, if it goes from point A to point B for clearance, so you can bring it into the United States. The label, remember we talk about labels, the label is usually dubbed as IT or immediate transportation. There are other labels. There are other times when you need to export it in bond or import it, bring it in bond. So let's say, what country is south over here? Mexico. Okay. Anyone heard of maquiladoras? Those little factories, because of where United States companies move their production because of the cheap labor. They don't like to pay high wages. So sometimes you bring it in here, right, to Los Angeles, LA, I call it, and then you, without bringing it into the United States. Yes, Erica.
One new student.
Okay, welcome in, sir.
There's two more that want to observe your
Wow, looks like our class is getting popular. I think I know the reason why, because it's getting close to the exam date, right?
Yes.
Okay, come on in, sir. Have a seat.
And then the following two will be observed.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
All right. So, those students that are coming in, and we covered a lot of ground. So, if you guys at this point would like to take the exam, would like to sit there and try to increase your chances of passing, I would recommend for you, there is videos of every class, so this class is being recorded. And I would recommend, if you decide to stick with the program, to stay on and watch all the videos and to also pay attention to what's going on, all right, in the videos. So let me go back. So in bond. So when I bring it to LA, to the maquiladora in Mexico, without bringing it into the United States, it's not IT, it's not immediate transportation, because immediate transportation covers the things that are coming from overseas into the United States for consumption, to consume. Most of the, if it goes for export right away, it will be called something T&E, transportation and exportation entry. There are other situations. So let's talk about sugar. So what's Sunny? What's the deal with sugar? What's the big thing about sugar as far as imports are concerned? High duties or quotas? Quotas? Yeah. So it's not the high duties that are a problem in case of the sugar. It's the quota, because we need to protect our farmers. At least that's what the political branch, the Congress, is saying. And because they say that, we must go with them because they make the laws. And one of the things that arise is that you sometimes reach the quota limit, you reach the ceiling, and you cannot go above, but you have sugar here waiting to get into the United States customs territory of the United States and get consumed. So what happens? Well,